So for your final exam, you have a choice of what you're going to write your essay on, what prompt you're going to base your essay on. So this is a video for those folks who are basing their essay on prompt number one. All right. So let's just read the prompt together just to make sure that we understand it, and we're going to break it down. All right. And by the way, this is the same strategy you would use on tests. So if you get a prompt on an exam, whether it's an AP exam or any sort of English class exam, this is what you want to do. You want to break down the prompt to make sure you understand it. So the following passage is from James Weldon Johnson's novel, The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. In the passage, the narrator, who is never given a name, describes growing up in rural Georgia. Read the passage carefully. Then, in a well-organized essay, analyze the literary techniques Johnson uses in his characterization of the narrator. Focus on such literary techniques as diction, selection of detail, and point of view. All right, so the first thing we need to do is figure out what this prompt is telling us. But actually, before we do that, all of this front part is just context and filler. All right, those folks who write prompts love to front load them with things that may not be necessary or that give context. All right. So this part of the prompt just gives us some context. All right. It's about this novel. Here's the person we're thinking about, and here's something about their life. All right. So we read that and we move on. Now, in a well-organized essay, analyze literary techniques Johnson uses in his characterization of the narrator. Okay. That's something we have to do. All right. So specifically what we're doing, right, is we're writing a well-organized essay as opposed to a sloppy one. All right. And we're analyzing literary techniques. All right. Now, why are we analyzing those techniques? Because what we're looking for is how those techniques contribute to the characterization of the narrator. All right. So James Weldon Johnson is going to use various techniques, right, in creating this narrator. All right. So, in a well-organized essay, analyze literary techniques Johnson uses in his characterization of the narrator. Okay. So, ultimately, the goal here is to figure out how Johnson created this narrator, right, through the literary techniques he chose. Great. All right. Now, the AP folks love to give you suggestions, right, of how you might approach this. So, here's what they tell us. All right. They tell us focus on such literary techniques as diction, selection of detail, and point of view. All right. So let's break down these terms. Diction. All right. And let's write it down here. Diction means word choice. Okay. In other words, the words that the author chose specifically. Okay. So pretty straightforward. Now, what does that look like? All right. Well, if we look at the passage, for example, there are many diction choices that James Weldon Johnson makes, right? That give us a clue as to who this narrator is. All right. For example, he's born in a little town. Okay, not just a town, but a little town. All right. And he says, I have a faint recollection, right, of the place of my birth. All right. And then once again, we're back to little. I can see this in a half vision, a little house. All right. So we're noticing right away, not automatically, but right away, that he's using language here that implies either smallness, sort of weakness, right? Faint, something that's faint, it's not strong. So he seems to have a somewhat maybe less than positive view of where he grew up. Right? He seems to diminish where he grows up. He doesn't seem particularly proud of it. Right? And actually, if you remember from this section of the book, or if you even read on in this passage, you'll know that he actually, when he thinks about his hometown, it's usually fairly anxious. Right? It was actually a place that was not particularly happy. He goes on to reminisce about sort of physical abuse, as it were, these spankings that he received, and sort of the bottles in the ground and that sort of thing. And the diction reveals that. The diction reveals to us that he's not particularly proud, right? Or does he makes things seem smaller than they were. He has a faint recollection of things. Not crazy about this place. And there are many other examples in this text, in this particular passage, of this idea of diminishing something, making it seem smaller or insignificant. All right. So that's diction. Diction is how Johnson chose the words he chose. Right. And ultimately, the question is why? Why would an author choose these words? And in this case, why would the narrator choose the words he chose? All right. That's diction. Selection of detail. So let's go on to that. All right. What does that mean? Well, actually, it's kind of implied in the term. Okay. But selection of detail means what details, all right, does the narrator offer us? Okay. So, for example, what do we know? Well, we know he was born in Georgia. Okay, that's a detail. All right. We know he was born near the close of the Civil War. Okay, that's a detail. It's funny. He does not mention the name of the town. All right, that's interesting. That's a detail we don't get. All right, but so far he's clear to tell us he lives in Georgia and after the close of the Civil War, and those details are important. Right, we know that the narrator lives in a place. Right, probably, well, not even probably, that was full of vicious racism. Right, and separatism and segregation. And when we're talking about Georgia, it was among the worst, right? The deep South, right? It's not by accident that right away in the first sentence of this book, all right, if we don't include the introduction, the first sentence of the book, we get Georgia in Civil War. Okay, this is not going to be a book with a lot of pleasantries in it, right? We're talking the deep South, right after the Civil War, where it was not a happy time necessarily to be an African American, right? That's a crucial selection of detail, right? He didn't have to say that, right? The narrator did not have to mention Georgia and the Civil War, all right? But the first thing he does is mention these two specific details. So if you're answering the question, how does selection of detail add to the characterization of the narrator? We now know this narrator is very aware of history, right? Is very interested in geography, right? Specifically where he was born, right? And wants us to know that he had to deal, most likely, right off the bat, with the worst of the worst when it comes to prejudice, right? Because the Civil War was fought in Georgia, among other southern states and northern states as well. But the Civil War arguably was caused by southern recalcitrance against the North, or sort of southern aggression and slavery and all that. All right, so that's an example of how selection of detail, what that tells us about the narrator. All right, now the last thing it suggests that you think about, right, is point of view. All right, and actually we know about point of view because we discussed this. It was one of your first essential questions in your lit circles, right? And in this case, point of view is really the narration style. Okay, and we know it's a first-person narrator because I, right? The narrator refers to himself in the first person. I. More specifically, it's an autodiegetic narrator. Remember, autodiegetic means it's a first-person narrator who tells their own story. All right? And in this book, the narrator, the nameless narrator, tells his own story. Therefore, it is what we call autodiegetic. Remember, auto means self, and diegetic means narrative. So the question becomes, right, why did James Weldon Johnson choose to tell this story in an autodiegetic way, right, in a first-person narrator fashion, right? That's significant. So when Johnson characterizes the narrator, right, he chooses to make that narrator a first-person narrator. So the question you have to think about is, what does Johnson gain by doing that? What message does the choice of a first-person narrator help to send to the reader? Right? So here are the three things that this AP prompt that you're going to be using as the basis for your final exam essay wants you to think about. Diction, word choice, selection of detail. Okay, what does the narrator tell us, and in some cases, what don't they tell us, right? And then point of view, narration style. All right. So what you'll do is that you will really what you want to do is think of a theme. Do you notice a theme in the diction? Do you notice a theme in the selection of detail? All right. And what does the point of view tell us? Now, my suggestion is that you don't pick all three. Okay. I'd be perfectly satisfied with a 4-paragraph essay. Okay. A short intro in which you set up your argument, 2 body paragraphs, Okay, one each for one of the things, one of the literary techniques you want to talk about, and then a conclusion. All right. So pick either diction, selection of detail, and/or point of view, but don't pick all three. All right, and pick the ones that go together. So, for example, you may decide that because he chose a first-person narrator, that's going to dictate his diction, right? Or the point of view is going to dictate the selection of detail, right? And we will help you sort of hone that argument.